Hey guys, Rob here, and today you join me for episode 41 of How It Was Made, and this is the Liberty Walk Nissan R34 Super Silhouette. Now obviously I love my Liberty Walk model cars, and when I saw this car that was debuted at the 2020 Tokyo Auto Salon, I knew that I wanted to have a model of this car in my collection, so this is the car that I am going to be building. Now the base model for this project is this Auto Art Nissan R34 GT S Tune. I got this for a reasonable price, and to help pay for the build of this new custom model, I actually removed the RB26DE TT engine out of this model and sold it on eBay. This is the engine that is in the car. This is an old school Nissan L28 straight 6 engine, and this came from a damaged Auto Art Devil Z model. Now these are the Advan GT wheels that I'm using. These are from tkdiecast.com, as well as all these custom made decals for this build. Now this engine has a bit of detail, so I had a bit of a splurge and I bought lots of little braided hoses and wires and things like that. Now first step as always is to disassemble the model. This is a fully opening model, so there are a lot of parts, and before I wanted to do the bodywork, I wanted to do all of the interior first. So I stripped that down, and next thing was to remove all this carpeting from the interior pan. Now I use the cleaning agent called Goo Gone, and that basically eats away all that flocking carpet material off the plastic. I then give it a bit of a clean up. Here you can see I'm disassembling the center console, as there is no center console in the Liberty Walk car, just a handbrake handle and a gear shifter lever on a bare black interior pan. Next I had to modify the dashboard, because also the dashboard has had the lower half cut off, and I was just test fitting some seats here. These were out of the parts box but were way too big for the interior. So the reason why I wanted to do the interior first is that there's lots of test fitting in and out of the body, and I wanted to do all of that before I worked on the wide body kit. And one thing that I had to do, now that the bottom half of the dashboard was removed, you could see through into the engine bay. So I used some styrene sheet there to build up that front of the interior pan, so that when the model was assembled and the half cut dashboard was back in place, you would not see a gap through there and see the inner workings of the car. So this is the model upside down with the interior pan in there. You can see it's closed up that gap, so that will be painted black when I repaint the interior. I then filled some of the holes in the interior pan, as there is no seats going back into the back of the model, and I also rounded the edges of the tunnel. Now to make it look like pressed metal where the rear seat has been deleted, I just used some styrene sheet to make a cross brace, and the back I'll be leaving all those holes there. Again, I added some styrene strips onto the back seat area, as well as having to make some new door panels. Now the Liberty Walk car doesn't run any door panels, it just has the inner metal shell, so I had to make a plastic panel to replace the door trims. Again, was just cutting some holes in the rear panels to represent the actual inner metal skin of the body without trims. And next was to modify the dash. So the GTR dash has a 3-pod assembly on the top. Because this Liberty Walk car is based on a GTT, it doesn't have that raised pod. So that was cut off, filled in with a sheet of styrene and putty, and then a new instrument panel was made out of styrene, just with some miscellaneous gauges to sit in behind. Now there's 5 toggle switches underneath this, and I have to make those as well. So here I've just final sanded that instrument panel, final sanded and filled the rear quarter panels, and I've just cut some more triangular shaped holes to look like the metal inside shell of the body. Here you can see I've modified the handbrake handle and actually made a plastic sheet base, which is replicating the metal base of the handbrake handle that would usually be hidden under the center console. And these are my new door trims that are to look like the inside metal skin of the door, hence the speaker hole and the groove lines. So I've just painted all these in matte black to start with to get a bit of a look at how it is coming together. And as you can see here, the full interior will be gloss black, but those few additions of styrene sheet here and there and all the holes cut in the bodywork make it look a bit more like a stripped out interior. Next, I made a template for the roll cage. So I always start with the main hoop of the roll bar. So I just make a template that fits in between the B-pillar trims to get that first bend. I then use 2mm diameter evergreen styrene solid tube, and I just heat that up with a cigarette lighter and bend the main hoop first. Once that's in place, then you can continue to make the other bars that go to the back of the model, cross braces and such. And to get a good join of the plastic tubing where it meets another piece of plastic tubing, I will actually use a small round jeweler's file. Now if you file the end of the plastic tubing, that will notch it out in a round shape and you'll get a good fit of those plastic bars. Here you can see I'm working on the front bars that go down through the old air conditioning vents of the dashboard, and then I'm making some vents underneath as well. Now these will all link up and join together once the interior gets assembled back into the model, but this is the best way to do it in separate pieces. So these top bars that go into the roof will be painted separately and glued in place once the model is getting assembled for the last time. The roll cage was then painted in chrome yellow because it looks cool and that's the colour in the real car. And I also made some modifications to the roof lining panel. I've deleted the roof lining panel. Here is the engine assembly, painted black. And then I went into the spray booth and I painted all of the interior parts in a clear 2K clear coat, as well as the roll cage and the wheels. And this is ready to start assembling. So this is how the real car is. It's a completely stripped out interior and it is full gloss black. So pretty happy with how this all came out. This is the dashboard. I've added some little toggle switches that I clipped some paper clips into little sections of metal and glued those in place. And the little stop button is just some styrene tube painted red. I then glued in the roll cage into the interior pan and then glued on the pedals, the gear shifter and the new handbrake handle as well. I then glued on the rear trim panels either side where the back seat would go, and this is a cool new steering wheel and quick release resin pieces that I got from TK Diecast. I painted them up, added the yellow stripe on the top of the steering wheel. And these are also some seat bases from TK Diecast also. Same as these seats, these are a Bride or Breed Zeta 3 seat painted red. And I've masked the seats up here to paint the back of the seats in a charcoal grey like the real car. I then applied some Bride decals and did the black paint outs on the front of the seats also. So these seats now match the real car, with the exception that the real car has Bride Zeta 4s in it, but I could not buy those seats in model form. Steering wheel and quick release assembly was then glued onto the dashboard, and that is basically the interior complete with the dashboard just sitting in place. So really happy with how this came out. It really does look like the real car. And next one I had to do was to remove some of the writing from the top of the back window and apply the new decals. Now these are the wheels from TK Diecast. They're an Advan GT in 18 inch, but they're all the same width. So I bought some spare barrels, cut those down and glued a extra section on the back of the rear wheels to suit the rear tyres. I then undercoated and sprayed the wheels in matte black as well as the mounting hubs. I then applied the Advan GT decals to each of the spokes on the wheels and then I finished those off with a 2K clear coat. I then fitted the tyres, which are quite chunky, and they're from the parts box, but originally from Legend Miniatures, and added the Advan decals to the tyres. I then am using some brake calipers and rotors from an old Auto Art 350Z model, as they're the same size as a R34 Skyline GTT. Now, next I'm going to move on to the engine assembly. So I've just test fitted this interior engine piece back into the die-cast body, and this is, as I said, the engine from a Auto Art Devil Z 240Z Nissan model. Now, this was a forced induction version in that particular Devil Z model, so I'm removing the forced induction section and reverting it back to carburetors with the trumpets. So as a test fit, the engine fits fine. It is a straight 6, just like the RB26 DETT that you find in the R34 GTR, so there's no problem with the length of this motor. So I stripped all the parts out of the Devil Z engine bay, found a few extra bits and pieces out of the parts box, and also some extra radiators that may be needed. Further breaking down this engine, decided what I had to make. This was a little extra fuel rail that I made out of some styrene sheet. The engine was first painted in Tamiya aluminium enamel, and the rocker cover was removed. Basically, I didn't need to strip the engine down any more than this. The rocker cover was then painted black, oil cap painted in silver, and the silver line around the top of the rocker cover. That was then glued back in place onto the motor. Then I had to sand a little flange off the face of all the carburetors, and then I glued on these 1/12 scale MFH factory, I think they are. I'll put a link in the description to some of these parts. These little air funnel trumpets come in a pack of 10, and they work perfectly for this job. Next, I had to see that the sump of this older engine was going to clear the steering rack, so there's just a lot of test fitting backwards and forwards here, and I clipped the bonnet back in place to make sure that the bonnet would close and not foul with the engine. Now, next thing I had to do was to check if the original old school gearbox would fit in place, and it is a lot smaller than the four-wheel drive transfer case from the RB26 DETT engine, so that fit in there no problem at all. Just a couple of millimeters shorter than the length of the old gearbox, but I can live with that. Now again, these are some of the little AN resin fittings and clear hoses, and some of the other parts that will have been painted and will be added into the engine bay. I then made a white styrene heat shield between the exhaust headers and the carburetors like the real car, and then I clear coated the engine assembly panel as well. Now, this is the first time I've ever made some headers for an engine out of plastic tube, and I needed to work out the lengths first. So this has a side exit exhaust, this Liberty Walk Super Silhouette, so I worked out where the exhaust outlet would be. This is the actual exhaust pipe from the Auto Art Devil Z 240Z, which I'll be cutting up and using. I then ground out the hole for the side exit exhaust, and then had to work out where the exhaust was going to run underneath the floor, and that required a little bit of modification and to grind out some of the chassis rail there. I then cut up and sectioned that exhaust pipe out of the Devil Z 240Z model, glued those together, and that will form the straight through exhaust. I then made a flange out of flat styrene sheet and just basically played around heating all the plastic tubing up to make the exhaust. Now I think I'm using 1.5 or 2 mil tubing for this exhaust. It could be 1.5. Next, I had to make a new radiator as the Devil Z radiator was too small, and I sold the R34 radiator. So I made that out of styrene sheet, added some photo etched radiator mesh onto that, and then test fitted that into the body. I had to add some little spacer blocks underneath. but that will work fine. So that is now ready to paint silver. And I also made a little radiator cap and overflow tube and stuck that on top of the radiator as well. I then painted up some of these little resin AN fittings and added those to the carburetors and just test fitted that exhaust headers underneath. Next, I painted some of the parts. I sprayed these in the Molotow chrome refill paint. And then I found some more pictures of the engine that were actually red, so I painted the bottom section of the motor red to match the real car. I then got some 0.5mm black wire to use for the new spark plug leads. I glued those into the engine block first until that was dry, and then I fed those around and joined them onto the engine distributor. This is my new fuel rail, which has the anodized fittings to feed each carburetor, and I've got to add a fuel line in and a fuel line out to that fuel rail. Here you can see the heat shield in place, and then the exhaust headers now glued in place as well. And again, this is some of the Top Studio braided hose, which looks very realistic. 0.8mm I think for this, and you basically just cut the end with a sharp hobby knife and you can glue it in place. This is my little fuel regulator that I made up, and as you can see here, the fuel lines from the fuel rail will join to the fuel regulator. Okay, now all that work was done, it's time to start on the bodywork. So first I wanted to check the stance and make sure the wheels would fit underneath the body, and then I printed out a picture of the car. Now there's plenty of pictures online of this car, so I was able to get a full side view of the car, scale the picture down to match the exact length of the die-cast model, and then I used that as a template. So this is 1mm styrene sheet, and then I cut two pieces out off the template. Now because this is pretty slab-sided, the side of this real car, I decided this was the best approach to make the side of the car. So just make sure when these were cut out that they were sanded and exactly the same size either side. Next thing I had to do here was to modify the rear bumper, as the whole lower part of the bumper has been removed to fit that huge Liberty Walk rear diffuser, and then I super glued that bumper bar onto the die-cast body. Next I decided to make the actual sill pieces. So this is some styrene sheet that was glued to the die-cast body. I actually used some baking paper underneath so the super glue didn't stick the body to my work table. And one thing I had to do here was to remove the front part of the rear fender bulge, as the real car is based on a GTT, not a GTR. I also had to remove the GTR wing legs from the boot lid, so I ground those off, sanded away, and then just filled up all the holes and scratches with Tamiya putty. Next I tackled the bonnet. I decided what the size of the openings would be and the louvers. I then cut that out with a Dremel cutting disc, and then I use a jeweler's file to file all the edges smooth and get nice square corners. As you can see here, I added a little bit of angle to that back opening edge of that central part. I then formed the bonnet edges and the lip at the front just out of styrene sheet. That is just glued in place with super glue to make sure it's nice and strong, and then I can use Tamiya putty and blend it all together and fill the gaps up. This works really well, and there was a teardrop shape scoop in the bonnet as well. That was not in this bonnet, so that was filled with styrene and putty. I then made the side vents in the bonnet just out of 0.5mm styrene sheet. Now I'm just using the thickness of the die-cast bonnets here and just laying those on an angle and making sure they're all the same angle when they're glued in place. And then by the time this is final filled and painted and clear coated, that will just all blend in into one piece. So that's how I make my vented bonnets. Now this is the rear boot lid, just a bit of primer on it to check that the holes were filled, and this is the front part of the wide body fenders removed, ground off and filled. Next is to make the spaces for the big side panel styrene sheet that I made. Now it's not perfectly straight all the way through. The front fender does not stick out as much as the rear fender, and the side skirt has a little bit of a curvature in it. So I added all these little styrene blocks around the wheel arches, and then you'll be able to see in a moment that the actual shape of the styrene follows the fender, so it has a bit of a curve in it, and it does have a curve through the side skirt as well as the front here. You can see I've used some masking tape to pull the styrene in. I'm just test fitting here to check the angle of the top part of the body kit, as this will be made out of styrene sheet as well. And what I realized was it was a bit too wide. I didn't allow for the GTR wide body flares, so I used my Dremel. I put a cut in the center of all those blocks to remove 1 mil of styrene, and then I glued those blocks back together. Now what that did was to bring the wheel arch extensions in on the rear. Pretty easy to do without having to redo the whole model. I then went through all the corners. I started with the front. I built the angled top section of the fenders. Again, this is a really square and blocky style wide body kit, so no need to do it out of putty at this stage. It was just done out of styrene sheet. It's a little bit easier to work to. You can draw lines on the body and glue it in place. Same as the underside of the rear bumper here, they were just glued in place. Just checking with the hood in place and looking at pictures behind my work area to see how it's coming together, and I was reasonably happy with it at this stage. I did do a couple of little tweaks here and there, but it's all just out of styrene sheet. Now next thing I want to do is backfill with putty. So what I've done, I've put some masking tape on the top of the fenders so that when I push the putty in from the underside, as you can see here, it doesn't break the styrene joints because the styrene is quite brittle. So what I'm basically doing is filling as much as I can of the inside of the styrene shape. Same with the side sill here. I filled most of it just with styrene blocks, and then I used a few skims of putty to basically fill up that side skirt area. I had to fill in the word Skyline in the back of the bumper bar, as that has been deleted on the Liberty Walk car, and just having another test look and see how it's coming together. Now the Liberty Walk rear wing is quite complicated, and if I can always use something as a base to build with, it makes it a lot easier than building it from scratch. So this was a Mitsubishi Evo 7 rear wing, I think, from TK Diecast, and I cut the wing blades off, and I'm actually using those three-dimensional side shapes, and then I just reshaped those to the shape of the Liberty Walk wings. I had to make new bases that step those wing legs off from the boot lid, so I just made those out of some 2mm styrene sheet, sanded the angles in there. I then glued those onto the boot lid where they were supposed to go, and then those new reshaped Evo 7 Mitsubishi wing legs were then glued onto the styrene sheet. Now obviously there's still some putty blending and to mould that all together into one, but I'm just working on the wing blade now. These are the end plates. I then made a wing blade out of some styrene sheet, and then basically glued that to the side white styrene sheets, as I still want that to be a separate piece so I can paint it a different color. I then made the central support leg as well. So I do all this basic work first to just check the shape and the proportion before I go too far with the wing legs, so that if I have to change anything, it's easier to do it at that point. Now I'm happy with how that sat. I can now work on these wing sides. So these were sanded, as you can see, the yellowy coloured resin parts have been sanded and blended into the white styrene bases I made, and I'm pretty happy with how that looks. So I always apply a coat of grey primer because that will show up any of the little holes or gaps that need to be filled, as it's a bit hard to see those when the parts are raw. But I'm pretty happy with how that came out, using that wing from TK Diecast as a base. Now, I had filled the rear quarters here with putty, but I wanted to fill those or cap those off with a piece of styrene rather than try and sand the putty smooth. And then it's just a matter of a lot of sanding, as you can see by all the dust on my workbench there. I used a sanding drum on a Dremel here to just trace it around the metal edge of the inside wheel well, and that will basically gives me the finished shape of the wheel well in the styrene as it is following the die cast. Now, I had to sand this fender here, that's why you can see the crack. I've actually sanded through the styrene sheet because it was a little bit wider on that side than the other side. So it's just a matter of going through your sanding process. Once you've got one side how you like it, go and check the other side, and just keep measuring with a little steel rule to get exactly the same width as the other side. And here I've used the Dremel and ground out some die cast and the putty so that the tyre will sit up behind the styrene fender, as you can see here. That way, when the model is finished, I will be able to mount it so it's slammed on the ground on its air suspension. So definitely want to do that at this point, so that if you do accidentally go through the styrene or anything like that, you can refill it or patch it at this stage. You want to definitely do something like that before the model goes into paint. So what I did here, again, just checking with the wheels in there, checking the fitment of the front bumper and the headlights. There's still more work to do on the wide body. Looking at pictures, I was too wide at the front here, so I had to I mark out where I want to sand to. I'll sand the vertical edge first, rather than try and sand the shape in one go. So you can see I've sanded it here, blended it into the headlight bucket. Now that I've got the vertical shape, then I approach and tackle the top shape. So the actual fender tapered down a lot more towards the turn signal on the headlight than I had it. So I then sanded that all back down and got that looking presentable. Still not finished, but we're moving on to the bumper bar now. So the front bumper bar, quite unique on this Liberty Walk car, has a big extended front like a Bozozoku car. So first I had to cut out the lower part of the bumper bar, the lower part of the side air ducts, and then I glued the lower splitter onto the bumper bar. Now that's one of my new toys, these little saw blades that fit into your X-Acto knife. I got those off eBay and they are fantastic. Next I had to work out the actual size of that new front splitter. So I basically sketched that out, bend a piece of metal until I'm happy with it, and it is a lot wider than the stock bumper bar, so I cut the sides of that bumper bar off as I need those still, but they have to go out wider. So as you can see here, I've glued in some 2mm spacer blocks between the bumper where I've cut it, and then with the bumper bar in position and those side pieces propped up with some styrene underneath, I've glued those to match my new fenders, because I want to keep those sides because they have that sort of crescent moon shape air scoop in the side, and I didn't want to have to try and build those from scratch. Next I just used some cardboard to work out these fins and this front extension piece. Now that I was happy with that, I could apply some filler and actually fill the gaps where I cut and opened up the bumper bar. I also added some to the inside of the air scoops, and I've given this a sand up here to check that it is working out how I want it. I've then glued this bumper bar to my styrene sheet underneath and trimmed it down a bit more in width. I've added some extra pieces of styrene at the front of these side skirts, and now I'm adding this raised deck piece from the splitter to the mouth openings of the bumper bar, and then I've actually glued in those triangular pieces on the side as well. and then the side infills also onto that bumper bar. So that basically forms the shape, and lots of checking with pictures. And what I found that I was a little bit too square on the corners, so I did do some revisions in the sanding there, but I also had to extend the mouth a bit deeper into the radiator. As you would see, there's no mesh in the front of this model, and so I just built a little deck out of some styrene tube, piece of flat styrene on it, and filled it in with putty. Now I had to check the clearance of the doors to the side skirts, because last thing you want to do is paint the model and then realise when you fit the doors they don't open. So once all that was clearanced and checked, it was final sanded and the body went into grey primer again. Same as the front bumper bar, as you can see here. And with a few more little fills of Tamiya putty, sanded and primed the front hood and also the rear boot lid as well. This was the first time I actually had the model sat together with the rear wing, front bumper bar and bonnet on the model. I then just sat the interior in it and tucked the wheels underneath just to see how the progress was going, as it was a lot of hours just to get to this stage, so sometimes it's a little bit of a reward. Next I wanted to build the rear diffuser, so I'm using some evergreen 0.5mm styrene sheet here. So I just basically start in sections. So I build the front section first, a little bit of heat on the sides to bend the styrene, and then I just add and glue in the central fins underneath. So this is the best way. Don't be daunted by building something like this. It's quite easy, just do it in sections. So after the center section was done, I then built the side extension pieces. Again, just glue all this styrene sheet together with super glue, and then the vertical pieces that attach it to the side wide body were then made and glued into place. Just test fitting it under the back of the model to see how it fits. Fits and looks okay, so a little bit of sanding, and then I put that in grey primer as well. Again, it's just back and forward with these models, just filling, sanding, primer, filling, sanding, primer. And one thing I almost forgot were these little front guard or front fender vertical fins, and almost forgot to cut the hole in the side skirt as well for the exhaust tip. Again, more sanding and filling to get all the little imperfections out, and I also cut the hole for the side mount exhaust there. After all of that sanding was done, I was happy, and then I put the body into white 2K primer. Now all the parts were done in 2K primer just because it's a good base. It's quite a solid primer, so it does fill a lot of the tiny little scratches in the metal and the putty. All the primer was then sanded with super fine 3M sanding sponge, and then I went into the spray booth and I painted the body and all the body parts in actually a Ferrari colour called Rosso Corsa Red. I then applied a couple of light coats of clear onto all of these parts because the decal application will be next, and it's easier to apply decals to a gloss surface rather than a matte surface. I painted the rear diffuser black, and also the center section of the rear wing, that was also painted in black, and I just sprayed those in a Tamiya flat clear just to get it nice and consistent. Next stage was the masking, so I needed to mask all the body up so I could paint the lower part of the body in black. Now I'm not worrying about the thin black stripe because that will be applied with decal striping. So after all the masking was removed, you can see now that the bottom half of the model is black. A lot of time in the masking, and now I am applying a 0.8mm wide black pinstripe all the way along the top of the black separation to match the real car. I then started applying all my custom LBWK decals, all the brand decals, all the way around the model. Now these were all custom artwork and custom printed for me by tkdiecast.com, so if you need custom decals, they are the people to speak to. So after all the decals were applied on all of the parts, there are a lot of decals on this model, which is great. I really love applying decals to a freshly painted body. It's very rewarding, but it's now a couple of days to let all these decals dry thoroughly so there's no water underneath them. Again, I just sat the model together to have a little bit of a look, and then I put the model back in the spray booth and gave the model another 2 light coats of clear. So now you can see all the decals are under the clear coat, nice and shiny. I do still get a couple of little bits of dust here and there sometimes in my paint finishes, even though I'm using a proper mini spray booth, but some of these can be just sanded out and polished away. But with this particular model, I decided to actually color sand. So I basically sanded all the top layers of clear off, not going through the decals, and then I went back into the spray booth and I gave it one final coat of clear, which gave it a really smooth, glossy finish to the clear coat. So another step there than I usually do, but it came out really well, the paintwork, and it's impossible to see the edges of the decals underneath the clear coat. Now I let this dry for a couple of days before I handled it. I painted the windscreen and the side window rubbers black, fitted the door handles in the doors, and one thing I didn't tackle earlier was the side mirrors. Now this Liberty Walk car actually has the skyline mirrors deleted, so the little A-pillar mirror trims were sanded, painted matte black and glued in place. Here I'm adding some mesh to the front bumper bar, so the upper grille had mesh and the side vents. Rear tail lights were glued in from behind, and also the rear wing blade was glued into place on the boot lid, as you can see here. Absolutely huge wing on this car, but I do love it. The boot assembly was then fitted into the model, as well as the inside carpeted trim piece, and also the reverse lights underneath in the rear bumper bar, and then the struts were attached to the boot lid. Headlights were actually trimmed into separate pieces. As standard, they come joined together with a central piece. They were trimmed into separate pieces and then glued onto the actual bumper bar, and that's the bumper bar test fitted up to my new wide body just to check the gaps and clearances. I then added a piece of mesh into my new vented front bonnet or hood, and then I then fitted the rear window back into the model as well. Doors were then screwed back onto the model. No issues there with clearance, luckily. They don't close quite as tight as they did on the factory model, but I've added so many layers of clear to this, I knew that I may have a little bit of an issue there, but it's presentable, I'm happy with it. Then the engine trim piece was glued in place, brake booster. Inside metal replicated new door trims were glued on place on both sides, so hopefully that just looks like a inner metal door trim. The interior pan was then screwed back into place, no problems there, and you can see the roll cage through the back window and the open speaker holes through the rear deck. Next I test fitted the engine to make sure that was going to sit in the correct location. I was pretty happy with how that was in position. That was glued into place to the firewall. Then the front bonnet was reattached to the model, and the bonnet support rod was screwed back in place. That's a standard piece on the Auto Art model. I then glued in the new gearbox. The cross member was glued back in, and the new exhaust system was glued on. That tip on the outside is a piece of 5mm aluminium tube that was just hit with a hammer to flatten it out. Then the gloss black revised dashboard was refitted into the body, and with the model position upside down, the roof bars were glued in so that they stayed in place until the glue went off. Then I started to add some more details into the engine bay. So the radiator was glued in, battery, and a few other accessories. Then it was time for the front window to go back in, windscreen wipers, and then the front bumper bar was glued on for the final time. Wheels were then glued onto the model. Now I did cheat a little bit here and I did slice an angle on the inside of the tyre where it sits on the ground, as this car has excessive negative camber. And these are my new mirrors. So these were actually Lancia mirrors that I got from the autoartspares.com website. They were the closest I could find. These are my little radiator hoses with some little real metal clamps. Mirrors were painted, mirrors attached to the back of the mirrors, and then again a few more little bits and pieces added into the engine assembly, coil pack, and these are the new mirrors to match the real car. The model was then mounted to a BBR leatherette base, and that is the finished model. So look, overall this is definitely one of the most complex custom models that I've built over the last 5 years to 6 years. Over 300 hours in the build of this. I think it was around 315 to 320 hours. But overall really happy with the result. No one has made this model in scale, so that is a first for Rob's Model Cars. I've built a model that no one else in the world can buy right now, but I'm sure someone will build a model of this car. But I hope you enjoyed this how it was made series. It was a lot quicker to make this video than it was to build the car, but stay tuned, plenty more builds coming this year, and definitely stay tuned to the channel, more model reviews as well. But I've got some good models up my sleeve that I'm going to build this year as well, so this won't be the first fully detailed model like this, more to come. But anyway, thanks for watching Rob's Model Cars, and I'll see you on the next video. Cheers guys.
Perfect.